Hi, this is Dan Pertu. For the next episode of my Muse in Music video blog, I am thrilled to be talking with Francois Lopez Ferrer, Associate Conductor of the Cincinnati Symphony. Francois is also in demand as a guest conductor. His recent and upcoming highlights include debuts with the Los Angeles Philharmonic, Hong Kong Philharmonic, Orquesta Nacional de España, Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, Rochester Philharmonic, Omaha Symphony, Berliner Symphony Orchestra, and a host of other engagements. In 21-22, Lopez Ferrer was a Dudamel Fellow with the Los Angeles Philharmonic. As Associate Conductor of the Cincinnati Symphony and May Festival, he conducted the CSO Young People's Concerts and provided artistic support to the music director. On this video blog, we discuss what Francois finds to be inspiring about his work as a conductor, particularly his work with living composers. We talk about the importance of studying a composition's cultural context when preparing a score, and the process of having a dialogue with a living composer when performing new music. Francois gives us a behind-the-scenes look at the various psychological dynamics at play when orchestra musicians, conductors, and composers all interact to create a performance of a new piece. Please join me for this conversation. Great. I am thrilled to be talking today with Francois Lopez Ferrer, Associate Conductor of the Cincinnati Symphony. And we're going to be talking again about inspiration, because the theme of this video blog is what inspires musicians, performers, conductors, etc., in their work, and particularly as that pertains to the music of the present day. So welcome, and happy to talk with you today.
Very happy to be here as well. Thanks, Dan, for having me on the show.
Oh, wonderful. And he's joining us from Italy too, which really, that adds an exotic flavor to what we do frequently. I talk with people in America. So first, I would love to just dive right in with what inspires you about the work that you do as a conductor. What do you find to be just uplifting and inspiring about your work?
I think it's the profession of conducting, the profession of music, but especially conducting, is the most incredible expression of love and passion. It's bringing people together, of course, teamwork. There's the pedagogical aspect, which is more technical. And then there's the inspirational aspect, which is how this body of human beings breathe and play together and bring to life the greatest masterworks of history.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, and I love the way you brought up expression of love and compassion. And can you maybe go a little more with that, and then I'll talk about some of the others after that. Is it conveying those moods to the audience? Is it some other kind of way that you're thinking about it? Can you maybe expand on that a little bit?
Well, I think as an artist, or as a musician, but more generally as an artist, we feel and we love in our own personal ways. We feel passion in our own personal ways. Each piece of music, each work of art, every movie, it touches us in a different way. And our job is to then is to be sensitive to how other people also interpret the energy that we bring to the audience in the end, because how somebody might react to a Mahler symphony may be very different from your own reaction to it. So that's a big part of it. And then as far as just the relationship between the orchestra and the conductor is, as far as that's concerned, our job is to also manage and bring together different cultures, different feelings that each musician communicates, and manage that into a collective interpretation, which is in the end also an expression of love and passion, because that's why we do what we do. But our job is to manage that and bring it together.
Yeah, and what a big job, obviously, to be sensitive to how others interpret the energy from different compositions, and then also to bring together these, what, 90, 110 sometimes unique.
Fire, if you're doing a Mahler, a Mahler
Yeah,
song.
right. What, 1,000 even if we're talking about Mahler 8. But to bring together all of that, how do you get all of those different visions sort of to synchronize in the moment? So obviously it, and we're going to get to other things, but it comes down, to a combination of gesture and eye contact and intellectual understanding, then communicated through different gestures when you're on the podium. Can you talk just a little bit about that? Because I know the people who are interested in this blog might be particularly interested in that, because frankly, I don't think I've ever asked a conductor about that one before. So
Well, I would say, I mean, it's music making is 50%, 40, 50, 60% psychology, and then the remainder of music. Because if you're all music and no psychology, there's no way to convey your interpretation and convince those in front of you of what you believe. And originating from what the composer intended in the first place, and of course, then it's your interpretation, and then the collective interpretation as the end. So I would say that it's a big part psychology, because if you know how to speak to people, if you know how, and I mean, this, we've seen this in history, different types of conductors representative of different eras. I mean, the more dictatorial conductors, the more democratic conductors, the more seductive conductors as well. If you look at somebody like Georges Prete, I mean, it's pure seduction, the way he rehearses, the way he communicates with the musicians. And that's also reflective of your personality. Depending on what kind of person you are, you cannot change your personality on the podium. So psychology is such a big part of it. I mean, especially for us young conductors, where we're figuring out also who we are off the stage, and then on the stage as well, putting that, our personality together. Because if you can't communicate with people, it doesn't work in the end. So you can be the greatest musician in the world, but if you don't have the technique of personality, of being, not only conducting technique, to communicate that, to convey something, to convey your ideas, then the result doesn't get produced.
yeah, it doesn't take off for sure. So, and the psychological dimension that you're talking about actually has, so it has multiple elements which you had brought up. First, the idea of getting into the mind of the composer, and then some of the other elements that you mentioned. Could you maybe expand a little bit on that? So you had mentioned Mahler, and then of course there's, living composers that you can actually talk to. But before we get to the living ones, I personally think the psychology of the composer is utterly fascinating. And so all you have with the dead ones is a score. And then you also have maybe some secondary sources, their writings about the music maybe, and, some research that you can do there. Or, other people's writings about it. So how do you personally get into the mind of the composer so that you yourself as a conductor can bring out what you want in a piece of music and then convey it to your orchestra or the orchestra that you're rehearsing, and then eventually convey that somehow to the audience? Can you go into that process a little?
Yeah, I think it all starts with the score. If you have the score 100% from memory, great. You have the music, you have the notes, you have the articulations, you have the dynamics, super. It doesn't mean that you can build an interpretation from there, because a huge part of it is just understanding the composer, him or herself, where they're from, the era that they were from, what they felt, the literature that they were into, their inspiration behind each work, the aesthetic of the time, the style, of course, of the time. I mean, these are all incredibly important things, all of which serve to build your interpretation of a piece. So I always start, of course, with a score and just absorb it as much as possible, play it at the piano, listen to lots of different recordings of different conductors, with a very judgmental perspective in mind in doing that, not just to enjoy and to learn
Sure.
the music, really to decide, right. I mean, to understand why each conductor does a certain kind of rubato, maybe where it's not written or where it is written, but how much. These are all things that I think recordings serve for. But the other part is just also experiencing life and traveling. I mean, that's a huge part of it. I think it's very difficult to conduct Italian music. I mean, Italian opera without having ever been in Italy and just sitting in a cafe. I mean, you learn a lot about the people and a lot about then the composer in turn, even if it's a whole different era. I mean, the Italy of today is not the Italy from 100 years ago,
Right.
But you see that how it's transformed into what it is today, and then and that serves in looking back into history as well. Also, I don't think this is the most important thing, but I think it certainly helps. I mean, I grew up with a lot of growing up in Switzerland some years, and then growing up in the States, and then going back for my studies in Switzerland. Switzerland is a country with 4 official languages, one of which is not English, but then English would be the 5th one. So German, Italian, French, and Romansh, which nobody really speaks anymore. But anyway, so I mean, just having at least a basis in various languages, even if you can't speak them, but just have an understanding of how they function, that helps so much in building an interpretation as well, because music is also accentuated, and how it's accentuated is very much based on somebody's culture and the way somebody speaks.
So yeah, the linguistic component there, of course, makes a lot of sense. And really,
especially when it comes to opera, I think that's indispensable.
Of course, and you're also speaking more generally, even to the importance of the cultural context. So everything, sort of the common denominator of everything you said there. You talk about the era, the literature, the inspiration, the sense of time, the language. All of these are manifestations of the cultural context, and having a deep understanding of that cultural context is absolutely critical. And then you bring to bear your own interpretation of that. You listen, as you said, judgmentally or analytically or whatever to other approaches, and then you put your own sort of unique stamp on it, basically, is what I'm hearing. So how does this then apply to working with music of living composers? So obviously with living composers, there's the opportunity to talk to them. But so of course it changes the entire dynamic, but also there are aspects that are obviously still the same. Could you maybe talk a little more about now how that changes with living composers?
Well, I want to touch on that because, I mean, what you mentioned earlier about the mentality of a composer, sometimes when you meet a composer for the first time, even if you've known their music, living composers, of course, sometimes their personalities are very surprising because they don't necessarily reflect what you may have thought. I mean, if you think about somebody like Shostakovich, who hardly opened his mouth, and you hear the passion and the criticism, and I mean, just the rapture in his music and the depth of it. And then you see a picture of him, or even a video, or talk to people who knew him and worked with him. It's completely disaligned with what you would expect. So that's the beautiful thing about getting to meet and work with living composers, is that you can also then delve into their personalities, and which sometimes may not reflect what your expectation is. but especially there's certain composers who write incredibly living composers I'm talking about, who write incredibly detailed, in a very detailed fashion in their music. And then if they're in the rehearsal and there's a question that comes up, they're very laissez-faire, laissez-faire.
Yes.
So, yeah. And then there's others who are incredibly demanding and really detail oriented in how they want to bring that out, even if it's not detail oriented as it's written in the music. So that's a really fascinating thing. And for me, I always find it much easier, doing a new piece with the composer there, or even not there. I mean, you can communicate with them and ask them certain questions. So it's because you can just easily turn around and you have the composer at your side. I mean, I did, which is when I did the Mark Simpson violin concerto.
Yes.
Massive piece. I was jumping in at the last minute as well, kind of 3 days before the first rehearsal. So I at least had that, but it was just this massive piece of music. So that was super helpful having him there, because lots of questions which I would have needed a month to really get this into myself in a deeper way. Of course, I had his help at my side. I mean, from questions about tempo, articulation, certain things that needed to be explained to different sections on how to play, certain extended techniques and so forth. That was extremely helpful. So, that's something that we don't have when we conduct the great masterworks of the past. So a lot of it is, of course, open to interpretation, or, what we learned in conservatory from the student of the student of the students,
yes.
The student of Hans Liszt or whatever. And that's all great, but a lot of that gets lost. What is that game called? Phone,
Telephone, yeah.
A lot of that just gets lost in the end. So, I mean, I take all those things with a grain of salt as well. When you hear what somebody may have said in the past,
generations ago. Yeah.
There's certain treatises, of course, that are very helpful, but it's not a means to an end in the end. I mean, if you listen to two different interpretations of any Mozart symphony, they can be one as good as the other, but completely different. And we know that that's just comes down to our personal choices and our personal likes and dislikes, because in the end, we are living, breathing creatures, and we feel things different ways. And when we're conducting or performing a work of somebody else, it's always going to be different than what they themselves imagined.
Sure. So thinking about the interaction, when you're on the podium and the composer's in the audience and you're in rehearsal and you're talking about that. And I remember observing, I was there observing that rehearsal, which was great to see. And of course the concert. And as a composer myself, I've been in the audience a lot. Although I've done some conducting, and of course I love when I'm able to conduct my own music, but that's not very common. So when I'm in the audience and I'm working with a conductor, I frequently think about, because I've been on both sides. Okay, you're the authority in many respects. You're the leader. You're bringing this work alive, sort of in real time. You're going to be doing the performance. And as a composer, of course, I have to be sensitive to all of that. I have to be sensitive to the psychological dynamics between the orchestra and the conductor. As a composer, I'm always concerned about balancing getting what I would like to come across without sort of overstepping, right, and getting in the way of what the artists are doing. I remember there have been multiple times where a conductor or an orchestra has done something really incredible with my music, actually, that I hadn't really conceived of. I mean, it was sort of buried in there, but it wasn't at the top of my mind. And it was like, and I said to them, just do that. That's amazing. And then I'll just put it in the score later. Or they had a question about something like, oh my goodness, is this right? Or, what about that phrase? And I'd be like, whatever, it's fine. Whatever you did was fine. So, but by the same token, then there are other times where it's like, oh boy, this is really not coming across, and I know it could. So how do I tactfully and diplomatically say that? And then when you're dealing with limited time, then there's that component. And I have to admit, there was a time when, I said a couple comments, and then the conductor was like, I thought, oh boy, did I overstep? So it's always it's always this balance. How can you comment on your experience with those kinds of psychological dynamics? Since you mentioned the psychology of working with people, and how do you navigate through that and sort of get to the best artistic product without, there being too much awkwardness or,
Sure.
or yeah.
Well, I think what you mentioned, time is one thing, certainly. Second is probably seniority. And then third is just personality. So it depends on what kind of conductor you are that you're working with, because, well, time, that explains itself. I mean, you have maybe a 2-hour rehearsal. Oftentimes, unfortunately, which I hope to change in the future, that contemporary music is dedicated the time that it should be, because sometimes people think, oh, well, nobody knows it, so let's just put it in the 2-hour slot in the afternoon and we come together. And even if it doesn't, then nobody will notice anyway. That's not true. Depends on the kind of music as well, but generally it doesn't.
Right.
And you also need time to not just to put it together, but also for the musicians to absorb the piece, because it's one thing to play notes even perfectly, but another thing to absorb it and make it your own. And then the second thing is, of course, seniority. I mean, if you're working with a conductor, age plays a part in it. Also, I suppose, I don't like to mention that, but who has the bigger career and all this kind of stuff, and who has the bigger ego. I mean, you have to consider those things. And then the third is just personality. I mean, some conductors are more open to that. Other conductors are not. It's a very similar thing, actually, to the which has been sort of my career path up until now. As an assistant conductor, when you're covering, some conductors, they look back constantly and they want your feedback. They want your feedback right away. They call you to the stage. Other conductors, they just want you to give comments backstage after the rehearsal or during the break. So those are all aspects that need to be taken into consideration by the conductor and also by the composer. Me, I'm very open, and I just want to make it the best as possible, as quickly as possible. Of course, as long as there's mutual respect involved, which I've never experienced otherwise. Hopefully, knock on wood, that'll be the case in the future. But I like just to make things happen in the moment, and I like that collegiality and that communication directly with the composer, because then also, I mean, the thing is, unfortunately, I think that's probably changed in the 20th and also 21st centuries. Somehow the conductor became this big authority, but originally conducting was just for composers to put their music together and make it work. With Lully, with his the stick, what was it called, the staff, where he himself put. So I mean, yeah, I think the composer in the past was and should be still the ultimate authority in the end. But as you mentioned, there's all different types of power dynamics and all different aspects of one's personality that you always have to be careful with. It's the same thing in regular life. I mean, when you meet somebody, I mean, we don't have this in English, but we did have it many, many years ago. But formality, I mean, in French or in German, you have the formal way of introducing yourself or of greeting somebody, or if you don't know the person, or if it's somebody who's older than you. I mean, if you're in a very conservative Spanish family, you speak to your parents as usted, which is the formal always. For example, that was not my case, but that's being half Spanish as well. But that's a big part of it, just formality as well.
Yeah, I mean, and this certainly isn't all of it, but it certainly does play a role. We're talking about the behind the scenes aspect of putting together a work of art. It's very much a a performance of a work of art. It is very much a human um, process. It's not just, okay, you can get on the podium, the notes are there, you do what you do, and the musicians do what they do, and then they all go home after rehearsal, and then you have a brilliant concert. It's much more than that. So I appreciate your giving your insight into sort of the behind the scenes working of that. Now, moving on more specifically to contemporary music, what kinds of what about contemporary music do you find to be inspiring or interesting or intriguing? And can you talk specifically about particular kinds or aesthetic styles or things that draw you to music of the present day and what's important about bringing it to life?
Well, I mean, I think this just applies to all music. And this is, you know, if we take all music in history, I mean, what survived and what is played today is 0.01%, I suppose, what's actually survived. The difference between today and the past is that we're what, 8 billion, almost 9 billion people in the world, if I'm not wrong. You can look that up afterwards. But it's the quantity that's being put out now, and the accessibility to so many more people to be able to produce music. So there's so much more out there, and that's why there's so many stuff. I asked this question to Guillaume Connaissant, a wonderful French composer whose oboe concerto was premiered in Cincinnati. I was assisting for that about a month or so ago. And we spoke about that, and he said that's the wonderful and the difficult thing about being a composer today, is that there's just so much you can do that it opens up lots of possibilities, but it also constricts you a little bit because you don't know where to start, with what style, or if you want to do something new, what does that even mean nowadays? You know, I think when Stravinsky wrote The Rite of Spring, I think he understood I'm doing something that has basically not been done before. You know,
right.
Somebody was, you know, in their shower singing something crazy, and you know,
right.
But
or, I mean? Or Schoenberg with the 12-tone system or whatever. Yeah,
precisely, exactly. So I think that, you know, they were super aware that they were doing something completely unheard of. Nowadays, it's not. I don't think that's the case.
No.
As far as aesthetics, I mean, not aesthetics. I would say, for me, the important thing is that a piece of music has to communicate something, communicate an idea, a story. It can some kind of narrative, or if it's purely abstract music, it should communicate some kind of philosophy, some feeling, some, or even it can be just something purely intellectual, which is often the case in many works. I mean, that can also be something. For me, I'm more about music that communicates a narrative, or just colors, or so that reflects something about real life, because that's the music that ultimately will remain, and that's the music that, especially music that's not based on traditional harmony and counterpoint, that's not tonal. That's the kind of music that will communicate something to an audience, because an audience comes to a concert to take away something from that experience. So that's, for me, the most important thing. And I mean, I've had the chance to work with recently Nico Muhly, for example, a wonderful composer, and it's incredibly intricate. It's partially intellectual music, and it's partially pure just emotion, feeling, and it satisfies you, I believe, both as the performer, as it did in my case in this piece called Shrink, or in turn also the audience. The ideal thing is that it's a piece of music should be as communicative and fun. I mean, fun, it can be one aspect of it, of course, but to play for the musicians as it is for the audience to listen to. So, you know, I mean, if you look at the music of Arvo Pärt, you know, incredibly meditative, reflective. I mean, that's a huge audience that he has right there in front of him. You know, I mean, it's not music that you necessarily need to have any kind of specific education or background to be able to appreciate and understand.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's also a huge aspect. I mean, there's certain kinds of music that you do need to have some kind of background and understanding, have read about it to understand what it's about. If not, I mean, it's hard to do so. That's not the case necessarily with a composer like Brahms, who's one of my favorite of all time, or Schumann. That's music that's very deep and profound, but that as a listener, upon first hearing, you can take away the top layer of a huge cake that you can go into really, really deeply, and always discover something new. So I think that's the kind of the main elements that make any great piece of music appealing, and that will allow it to have a long future ahead of it.
So yeah, I love the cake analogy. I mean, it absolutely, a cake or an iceberg or whatever you want, the tip of the iceberg, whatever you want to say. I mean, I think that is one measure. Now, there are probably lots of different measures if we're honest, but one measure of a great work of art, whether it's new or not so new, is whether if you can return to it over time and it keeps conveying something new and profound and interesting, one of the above, or maybe something else, some depth, some emotional depth, in different ways over time. I know that feeling, when I return to listening different pieces of music that I absolutely adore, and I haven't listened to them for a while, and then I hear, like with a different performer or something, certain thing is brought out. Or if I go to a performance, a live performance, and then the conductor of the orchestra bring out something, some other like counterpoint or different voice or something in the orchestration, or it's like, oh my goodness, that was in that piece too. Or I had the experience actually with my own music. I imagine what the percussion sounds like, especially. I mean, the MIDI, the computer realization will help with the non-percussion. It'll help with the strings and woodwinds. It's not ideal, but it helps. It's really miserable with percussion. And then and then I'm in rehearsal and I'm hearing, oh yeah, wow, that really did work, and it worked really well as compared to what I thought it was going to sound like, or I just forgot it. I had many times I've had the experience of, oh, I forgot I put that in there. That's a neat idea. Just because you don't have it, to listen to when you have the simulation. But so you're talking about though what it sounds to me like you have diverse tastes and interests when it comes to aesthetic styles and sensibilities in composers. You brought up Arvo Pärt, but also other composers who might not be quite as immediately accessible to broad audiences. But then you also mentioned Brahms or Schumann. So it sounds like there's a broad diversity of tastes of music that speak to you for different reasons. Is there so, and the common denominator you were saying was music that communicates some kind of narrative, particularly about real life, or things that would be broadly generalizable to lots of people, etc. Are there particular contemporary works that you think maybe do that really well, or different kinds of approaches to composition nowadays that really convey those different ideas that you had mentioned really, really well, or really dramatically, or that are a strong inspiration to you?
Well, I mean, one piece that just comes to mind that we did recently in Cincinnati, which was a huge revelation for me. I wasn't aware of it. I was aware that it existed, but I didn't know of it. Was El Niño by John Adams.
Okay.
And that was such an incredible piece of music, because I mean, not only there's the whole narrative behind it, but there's also there's also just this massive massive organism of sound in front of you. It's for choir. There's a trio a trio of countertenors. Such an interesting color. Children's choir, soloist, synthesizer. It's partially amplified. A really interesting piece. And I mean, this, and also the fact that this is kind of an aside, but that was a piece that really stuck out to me, because then 2 weeks later I went back to Stravinsky's Petrushka, and that's a really tricky piece to put together and find the tempi relationships and everything. But it's actually all quite clear if it's done the right way. It's basically just this kind of fluid rhythmic transformations throughout the entirety of the piece. I mean, the whole fourth tableau is it's all fluidly connected from one section to the next. And John Adams' music is all about that. And it was so interesting because I went from this piece, 2.5 hours long, but basically just from one breath from beginning to end, which is also a big part of, especially in contemporary music, which nowadays is a lot of times short pieces, kind of a concert opener, 10 minutes long. Very little do composers get the opportunity to write longer works, not necessarily a symphony, but just something, or an oratorio, or whatever you might want to call it, but just larger works, longer, which require also time and promotion and all that kind of, the more marketing aspects for an orchestra. So and this connection with what I was speaking about with Petrushka and this El Niño, I think there's two ways to write new music. It's one, to completely disregard the past, as some of the examples that we spoke about earlier sort of did to an extent. Stravinsky at the beginning of his career to an extent, and then also Schoenberg in the Second Viennese School, or to have this direct connection with what came before you. And I think the latter is what is more accessible for a public as well, because you always have something then, whether educated or not, but something to grasp onto. This is why a composer like John Williams is so incredibly accessible, because I mean, he would not have existed without Wagner, Puccini, this kind of, Gesamtkunstwerk, putting together. See, where every musical element is reflective of something going on the screen or on the stage. Or Holst in terms of aesthetic, and of course the famous Empire March and so forth. But I mean, it's that's why I think it's also so important in education for composers. I mean, this is something that I did my bachelor in composition, and that was something really important for one of my teachers, Joel Hoffman, was just really studying Bach or Bach's counterpoints. I mean, that's incredibly important, even if you never implement that into your music. But that connection to history can't be disregarded, because music is a reflection. It's a sort of soundtrack to our history. Mm-hmm. And the more connected new music is to the past, not too much either, because
you
find a balance, of course. I mean, to keep the progress going, the more it'll be accessible for a public, and the more that new music will stay alive.
And I appreciate what you're saying on multiple levels. I have to jump in for my own endorsement of counterpoint study, because that is one of the I also teach theory and composition and at a college, and counterpoint, I still teach it. And I always tell my students, I never really felt like I knew how to compose until I took courses in modal and tonal counterpoint. And I make sure my students can write a 3-voice fugue by the end of the semester when they're done studying that, which is, that's that's not easy. There's a lot of significant craft and intellect involved in it, and that doesn't necessarily mean that composers have to imitate that style, but it's the rigor and the balancing of unity and variety in a way that can then convey and also conveying new ideas while balancing unity and variety in effective ways. So yeah, and then of course, how does this all resonate with listeners? And of course, it is understandable, especially in the 20th century, with all of the different political and social upheavals and various other reasons, that there were lots of different kinds of music that broke with the past. I mean, they just wanted to have nothing to do with it, or not as much to do with it. But now we're back to a time where, I mean, of course, not all composers did that, but we're in a time now where a creative conversation with the past is actually very vibrant and important in current music. So I guess my last general question is about your take on programming of living composers in your conducting roles. I understand from what you were saying, you like to spend time with a composer in rehearsal. You believe it's important to have that creative interaction and dialogue. And of course, with programming for audiences, could you share then your thoughts about how do we keep new music alive or even thriving? Do we move beyond sort of the 10-minute concert opener? What is possible? What isn't possible? The programming of larger works. I mean, I feel fortunate to have concertos programmed, but when I was a younger composer, I thought that was never going to happen. And somehow it's happened, which I'll just be grateful. But, it requires an open-minded conductor and artistic administration team. And as you said, marketing and, being able to sell it to the audience and having an audience that's open-minded. So can you talk about sort of the whole process of composing or programming from your point of view, and what you would love to see for the field moving forward?
That's a big question. So I mean, to be honest, I don't have a direct answer for that, because I think that's also partly what's so exciting about the time that we live in, because I think for the first time, at least in the last probably 50 or 60 years, we don't really know what it's going to look like. The classical music, the orchestral music world, it's not, classical that's a whole other conversation, but that what orchestral and symphonic music will look like in 5 years, which is really exciting. And I think the kind of general answer, which is a kind of cheap answer, I suppose, but it's experimentation. You don't know what might work or what might not work. You have to experiment, and it has to go beyond, of course, the traditional thing of short kind of concert opener, contemporary composer, then Beethoven violin concerto, and then a Brahms symphony in the second half. I grew up with this music. That's what I love. I mean, if I could spend the rest of my life with that music, I would, but that's not realistic either, because that's also too much. We're doing this not only for ourselves, but also for society and for the audience in the end as well. So that's of course unrealistic, but it doesn't mean we have to stop playing the great masterworks, but we have to find a way to make it relevant. I mean, the world is changing. I think these pieces are all very relevant, but it's not necessarily, maybe not everybody's aware of that for themselves. So you have to find a way to make it accessible. I mean, something that somebody I've come across recently, I don't know him, but I think it's really interesting, is Steve Hackman. He's a conductor composer, and he'll put Coldplay next to Brahms, and the way that he had great orchestration, really good orchestrator. It's not the general, putting some Coldplay music and then orchestrating whatever. It's all a kind of inclusive enveloping experience. And I mean, those are maybe that's not a means to an end, but it's certainly a start. And then on the other hand, it's just commissioning. You have to commission as much as possible. I mean, like I said, what survived is 0. whatever percent of music from the past, and the only way that 0.0 whatever of great music written today that will survive 200, 300 years from now is through commissioning and taking risks. We have to take risks. I mean, as far as programming is concerned, I mean, if we're talking about the traditional concert format, overture, concerto, symphony on the second half, or big piece in the second half, and then shorter first half, or whatever it may be. I mean, that also needs to be experimented with which a lot of places are doing that. We have to commission as many works from as many diverse composers as possible, because that's what creates product, that's what creates audience, that's what creates passion. And in the end, this is why we do this. We're creators. Even as musicians, we're creating an interpretation. We're bringing to life an interpretation and creating sound. And we have to. That's the fruit of our daily bread.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, and certainly extremely inspiring. At least inspiring to me as a living composer, but also should be, I hope, inspiring to music lovers and orchestral music lovers. I also hesitate to say classical, because that's a problematic term, but orchestral music lovers and people who want to see our art form continue to, is it evolve or succeed or just move forward or whatever that means, and grow and change. So, well, I really, really appreciate your taking the time to talk with me today, and I look forward to hearing more about everything you're doing in the future. And thanks again for a wonderful conversation.
Thanks so much, Dan, for having me. Really appreciate it.